Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're exploring something that I've been very eager to investigate since first publishing my GeForce RTX 3080 review, and that is the weaker than expected resolution scaling of the new Ampere architecture. Now, before we get into it, please note this content is not designed to change your or our opinion of Ampere. Also, today's video sponsor is MSI. The new MSI B550 Gaming Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard and AMD Ryzen 9 3900X processor deliver a truly flagship experience for gaming, content creation, and productivity. Enjoy best-in-class features such as lightning quick PCIe Gen 4, the latest Wi-Fi 6, and 2.5 gigabits per second networking, a potent 12-phase VRM, and 6-layer PCB design, all topped off with sleek carbon looks. Together with AMD's 12-core, 24-thread Ryzen 9 3900X processor, you've got yourself one killer setup that can do it all for many years to come. So what are you waiting for? Enjoy more cores and faster performance today via the links in the video description. Okay, so as I was alluding to a moment ago, the RTX 3080 is currently the best value high-end GPU on the market by a country mile. Though, how on the market it is? Well, it's difficult to say with Nvidia just recently confirming shortages until 2021. So that does place the ball firmly in AMD's court, and we'll see what they can do later this month. Anyway, back to Ampere and its interesting quirks, one of which is the strange resolution scaling. So the aim here is to investigate and explain what's really happening rather than risk making any incorrect assumptions. For those of you who are not yet up to speed, in our RTX 3080 review, we found that at the 1440p resolution, performance was somewhat underwhelming relative to what was seen at 4K, and this was something all reviewers noticed. But almost all reviewers explained this away by simply suggesting it was a CPU bottleneck. The 3080 is just so powerful that even the latest and greatest Intel CPUs simply can't keep up. But we feel simply writing this off as just a CPU issue probably isn't that accurate. And part of that is because firstly, I tested both the Ryzen 9 3950X and Core i9 10900K and found that both often saw the same poor resolution scaling. Also, when taking a closer look at the Ampere architecture, it becomes quite clear that the CPU bottlenecking isn't the only issue here, and certainly some of the blame can be placed on the architecture. I noted this in my day one review by saying that part of the weaker than expected 1440p performance is down to the Ampere architecture and the change to the SM configuration. The 2x FP32 design can really only be fully utilized at 4K and beyond. And this is because at 4K, the portion of the render time per frame is heavier on FP32 shaders. At lower resolutions, such as 1440p for example, the vertice and triangle load is identical to what we see at 4K. But at the higher resolution, pixel shaders and computer effect shaders are more intensive, so they take longer, and therefore can fill the SM's FP32 ALUs better. And we often see high-performance GPUs better utilized at higher resolutions for similar reasons, so that in itself isn't particularly unusual. Higher resolutions always do a better job of putting core-heavy GPUs to work, and they also help to minimize other system bottlenecks. In the day one RTX 3080 review, we did see that the 2080 Ti extended its lead over the 2080 at 4K, going from 23% faster at 1440p to 28% faster at 4K. That said, we are only talking about a 5% performance discrepancy here, and the scaling at 1440p and 4K looks very similar. With the RTX 3080, we saw a 21% margin over the 2080 Ti at 1440p, and then a much larger 32% margin at 4K. At the time, I said this issue was largely with the Ampere architecture, which is a compute-heavy data center and AI architecture, not a gaming architecture. So with this video, we're going to explore how true that statement is by adding 1080p and 720p data to the 14-game sample. If we are seeing CPU performance influence the 1440p results, this will become very apparent with the 1080p data and extremely obvious at 720p. For all testing, I'll be using the Core i9 10900K, but it won't be overclocked as doing so would force me to retest at 1440p and 4K. So that is a lot of extra testing, which frankly is completely unnecessary, particularly given what you're about to see. I'll also be comparing the 3080 with the 2080 Ti, and while Turing wasn't an amazing architecture for efficiently scaling at low resolutions, it is better than Ampere, and given there's no other GPU architecture that comes close in terms of performance, it makes sense to use Turing. So with that, let's get into the results. Starting with Death Stranding, we see that the frame rates for the 2080 Ti increased by 68% when moving from 4K to 1440p, and then 28% from 1440p to 1080p before maxing out at 201 FPS at 720p. Now, the RTX 3080 on the other hand only saw a 53% performance increase when dropping down to 1440p from 4K, and then just a further 11% increase from 1440p to 1080p. That said, by the time we hit the 1080p resolution, we are starting to see the CPU limit performance, leaving very little headroom at 720p. So that's interesting to note, but it also means there's no CPU limitation at 1440p, so the weaker scaling from the RTX 3080 here cannot be blamed on the 10900K, not even a little bit. Moving on to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, this is a title that we know is heavily limited by CPU performance, as its DirectX 11 implementation mostly hammers just a single core. So based on what we're seeing here, it's plausible that the RTX 3080 is limited by the 10900K at 1440p, though given we do see a little more performance at 1080p and then a hard limit at 720p, I'd say we're just shy of limiting the 3080 at 1440p in this title. Now, if you thought the RTX 3080 was in any way CPU limited in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, well, you'd be wrong. Starting with the 2080 Ti results, here we're seeing an 82% performance uplift when dropping the resolution from 4K to 1440p, and then a 45% increase from 1440p to 1080p, and a further 47% increase from 1080p to 720p. So clearly no CPU bottlenecking going on there. That said, the RTX 3080 does appear to scale reasonably well here, as performance is improved by 76% when dropping down to 1440p from 4K, and then a 42% increase from 1440p to 1080p, and finally a 33% increase from 1080p to 720p, which at that point the CPU might be starting to limit performance. So at least here we're seeing good scaling from the 3080, but we already knew that it scaled well in Shadow of the Tomb Raider from our day one review. Next up, we have the Rainbow Six Siege results, and here we're clearly not CPU limited at 1080p, let alone 1440p. That said, as we often see in Vulkan-based titles, scaling for core-heavy GPUs is actually quite good. Relative to the 2080 Ti, the 3080 does scale quite well. The 2080 Ti, for example, sees a 98% improvement when lowering the resolution from 4K to 1440p, whereas the RTX 3080 saw a 90% improvement. Not quite as good, but it's not terrible scaling either. F1 2020 is yet another game where we're not even CPU limited at 1080p with the RTX 3080/10900K combo. Resolution scaling is also much better with the RTX 2080 Ti, which saw a 66% performance uplift when reducing the resolution from 4K to 1440p, and then 30% from 1440p to 1080p. The RTX 3080, on the other hand, only saw a 56% performance improvement when lowering the resolution from 4K to 1440p, and then 27% from 1440p to 1080p. We also find no CPU bottleneck in Gears 5 with the RTX 3080, all the way down to the 1080p resolution. The 2080 Ti though does scale better from 4K down to 1440p, though we're not really talking about a huge difference here. The margin does widen when going from 1440p to 1080p, but we are starting to approach the hard limits of the CPU. Now, the RTX 2080 Ti does scale considerably better in Horizon Zero Dawn. We see that from 4K to 1440p that the Turing-based GPU enjoys an 83% performance boost, and then a 46% boost from 1440p to 1080p. The RTX 3080, on the other hand, only saw a 70% increase when lowering the resolution from 4K to 1440p, and then just 21% from 1440p to 1080p, despite not running into any CPU bottlenecks. The game simply can't keep all those CUDA cores loaded with work when at these lower resolutions, and therefore the efficiency of the 3080 drops considerably. It's a similar story when testing with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Here we do see some pretty horrible resolution scaling results for the RTX 3080 relative to the 2080 Ti, whereas the 2080 Ti saw a 49% performance improvement when lowering the resolution from 4K to 1440p, we see just a 34% increase for the 3080, and a similar thing is seen when reducing the resolution from 1440p to 1080p. World War Z is another Vulkan-based title where we're again seeing good utilization for the RTX 3080, even at 1440p, though here we are running into a CPU bottleneck, evidenced by the 1% low results. So these results certainly aren't an example of the Ampere architecture scaling poorly across resolutions, but rather an example of a game that does become CPU limited at 1440p with high performance GPUs using a stock Intel CPU. Metro Exodus is a bit of a strange title when it comes to performance, though here we are talking about frame rates up around 200 FPS. There is certainly some kind of bottleneck going on with the RTX 3080 installed, but I don't think it's necessarily the CPU that's at fault here, but rather a driver overhead issue that affects scheduling for core-heavy GPUs like the RTX 3080. Whatever the cause though, the results are really interesting. The 2080 Ti and 3080 deliver identical FPS performance at 1080p, but when moving to 720p, the 2080 Ti gains a further 9% performance, whereas we see just a 3% increase with the 3080. Now, it is worth mentioning that the 720p performance doesn't really matter, as no one is going to use either of these GPUs at that resolution, but it does suggest that we're seeing much better scaling below 4K with the 2080 Ti, as it enjoyed a massive 81% performance uptick when downgrading from 4K to 1440p, whereas the 3080 only saw a 54% performance improvement. Resolution scaling performance is fairly consistent in Resident Evil 3 between the 2080 Ti and 3080. Both saw roughly a 90% performance uplift when dropping from 4K to 1440p, and then exactly 47% when going from 1440p to 1080p. It's not until we drop down to 720p that the 2080 Ti sees a larger performance gain, but we could also be reaching the limits of the CPU with the RTX 3080. Moving on to Doom Eternal, this is a game that you might have expected to scale very well with the RTX 3080. Well, at least I did. Granted, it's not terrible, but we are getting much better margins with the 2080 Ti, which saw an 80% performance increase when going from 4K to 1440p. The RTX 3080, on the other hand, saw a 66% improvement, and there's no chance the CPU is limiting performance at 1440p, given we see almost 50% more frames when dropping right down to 720p. Despite what we saw in Doom Eternal, scaling between the 2080 Ti and 3080 is quite consistent in Wolfenstein Youngblood. Both saw a 75% performance boost when dropping the resolution from 4K to 1440p, and frankly this is more what I was expecting to see in Doom. Then finally we have Hitman 2, which does start to limit the performance of the RTX 3080 at 1440p due to a CPU limitation, though I think this is more down to how the game's coded. In any case, the weaker than expected scaling from 4K to 1440p for the 3080 can be blamed on the game for this one. And finally, here's a quick look at the 14 game average, which lines up exactly with what we saw in our day one review using the Ryzen 9 3950X. The 2080 Ti on average scales around 10% better from 4K to 1440p, with a similar margin seen when going from 1440p to 1080p. Okay, so we've seen that you can't always blame the Ampere architecture, while equally, you can't always blame a CPU bottleneck. It does really depend on the game, and of course the hardware used for testing. It's quite clear though that for games such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Doom Eternal, F1 2020, Horizon Zero Dawn and Rainbow Six Siege, that the Ampere architecture is almost entirely to blame for the less impressive 1440p performance, at least relative to what's seen at 4K. In almost all of those games there was clearly no CPU bottleneck at 1440p, and the same was even true at 1080p. Stranding is another game that didn't run into a CPU bottleneck at 1440p, and again the weaker than expected performance of the RTX 3080 at this resolution can be blamed on the architecture. But here we did start to find the CPU limits at 1080p. It was also a similar situation with Gears 5, and we did see some weirdness in Metro Exodus that was likely a result of a combination of things. Then we found just 3 examples where you could blame the CPU for limiting the 1440p performance, or at least it was right on the verge, and certainly limited the performance at 1080p, and those titles included Hitman 2, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and World War Z. Then finally, we did see 3 examples where the Ampere architecture scaled very well, at least relative to the 2080 Ti, and those games included Resident Evil 3, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and Wolfenstein Youngblood. So, it's not always going to be the case where 1440p performance is poor compared to what we see at 4K, and this was also seen in our day one review where the 3080 ranged anywhere from 70% faster than the vanilla 2080 to as little as 40% when not CPU limited. In the end, we saw that with about half of the games tested, they don't scale down to lower resolutions very well with the RTX 3080, while a quarter are CPU limited, with the remaining quarter seen to scale reasonably well. And I think this ratio is going to apply for most of the reviews you saw out there from the various different media outlets, which is why overall we're seeing parts like the 3080 beat the old 2080 by about 70% at 4K and then just 50% at 1440p. So it'll be interesting to see if AMD can deliver a gaming-focused GPU with 3080 to 3090 Lite performance at 4K, and if so, it might see them enjoy a handy performance advantage at lower resolutions like 1440p, where Ampere is often less impressive. But of course, we'll just have to wait and see how that one plays out. Anyway, as for claiming that the RTX 3080 is CPU limited at 1440p, assuming that you're using something like a Core i7 8700K or better, chances are more often than not, you're going to be wrong on that call. Of course, this isn't really about being right or wrong, but rather working out what's really going on, as that will help you guys work out whether you do or don't need to upgrade. And on that note, I'll have an in-depth benchmark with the RTX 3080 using the Ryzen 5 3600, and not just a stock 3600, but I'll also be including some overclocked results as well, and then also some overclocked results with manually tuned memory. So there'll be a few different configurations there, and those results will be compared to the 3950X and 10900K. So that should be super interesting. Anyway, as for this video, that is going to do it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, one of those. You can also subscribe for more content from Hardware Unboxed. And if you'd like to join the exclusive Hardware Unboxed community, then you can do so over at Patreon. The link for that is in the video description. You'll get access to our monthly live streams, Q&As, behind the scenes videos, and our Discord chat. Very cool place if you're into all this sort of stuff. There's a lot of like-minded people there. Anyway, if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.